Where did Muggle-Borns come from? Since they have magic, why are they called that? Where did the term mudblood come from? And how did the prejudice against wizards born into Muggle families come about? Subtitle. Hey there, wizards! How's it going? If you're new here at the Leaky Cauldron, don't be a Muggle. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you can stay up to date with everything. And if you hear some bangs here, it's because there are fireworks going off. People are going crazy because Corinthians just won some championship. So, is everyone happy and celebrating? Although it's a widely known concept in the wizarding world, the ideology of blood purity hasn't always had many followers. There was a time when Muggle-Borns were not only accepted, but often considered particularly talented. Those who were born into non-magical families but possessed magic were even known by an affectionate term, Madbobs, which was simply a combination of the word magic and bob, meaning to appear. The meaning was something like magic that appears, because they believed this magic appeared out of nowhere in that particular individual. But, contrary to what was believed in the past, magic doesn't appear out of nowhere. After many studies, it was found that every wizard born into a Muggle family has at least one wizard ancestor in their lineage. What most commonly happened was that a squib, someone born to wizard parents but who doesn't develop magic, would marry a Muggle, and then, from this marriage, descendants would be born. These descendants without magic, but with the magical gene. They didn't develop magic, but the magical gene was there, so they would pass this gene down from generation to generation. And then there would come a moment when this gene became active, and the person is born a wizard. It's not that they're born a Muggle and acquire magic. That doesn't happen. That's impossible.
Muggle-born is simply a term, usually referring to someone born a Muggle, right?
They have no idea that somewhere in their family there was a wizard, because that information gets lost over generations. A very intriguing event happened in the United States of America. There, around 1692, when the witch hunts were at their peak, the episode of the Salem witch hunt happened, where some wizards denied their own origins, denied being wizards, but they didn't do this just to hide or protect themselves. They also hated other wizards and hunted them for rewards, and they married non-magical people. They deliberately chose non-magical people to be with, so that magic would be extinguished from their lineage. They intentionally married non-magical people, so their children would be squibs, making future generations non-magical.
In the United States, many wizards are born to non-magical people, called no-mods. Many wizards come from this background.
The wizards who hunted other wizards were known as purifiers. However, our main question today is, at what point in history, when did these people, who were admired and even had an affectionate nickname, become targets of prejudice and start being considered unworthy, impure?
Where did this strong prejudice against Muggle-Borns come from? It's very important for us to understand that what we're going to analyze here is very cultural and regional.
Every part of the world has its own way of dealing with Muggle-born wizards, and there isn't always prejudice. This scenario is more common in Europe and the United States. We see the magical community not making much of a distinction there. Everything magical coexists so much that we even see an illegal boat run by a goblin.
There are house elves, giants, wizards born from Muggles, and real wizards.
That's because they're pretty segregated from the non-magical world now. In the United Kingdom, discrimination based on ancestry started to take shape back when Hogwarts was founded in the 10th century, and I believe you can guess the name behind it.
One of the founders, Salazar Slytherin, argued that only those who came from entirely wizarding families should have the right to study magic.
But you know what's most curious? That was a view considered completely mistaken, not only by his fellow founders, but also by a large part of the wizarding community.
People didn't share that idea. They didn't sympathize with it, so the things that Salazar said and believed didn't have any strength at the time.
Of course, like every eugenicist, Salazar Slytherin appealed to pseudoscience, linking a bunch of characteristics to heredity that, according to him, made someone superior. Slytherin published several so-called studies, in heavy quotation marks, about supposed indicators of blood purity, in addition to the family tree itself, a physical way to identify whether a wizard was pure or not, according to these articles by Slytherin. What was most commonly mentioned there was that pureblood wizards showed early magical ability before the age of 3, and also prowess and boldness before the age of 7.
It was also considered an indicator of blood purity if the pureblood child had an aversion to pigs, because pigs are creatures considered completely non-magical and particularly difficult to enchant.
Another indicator, according to these Slytherin articles, was that the pureblood baby showed fear and discomfort near Muggles or Muggle-Borns, and also that pureblood wizards possessed a distinct and remarkable beauty. Yeah, we can see how great Crabbe, Goyle, and Salazar are, right? Such rare beauty, huh? Obviously, at the time, no one with the slightest bit of common sense took that nonsense seriously. But that's where the danger of speeches like Salazar Slytherin's lies.
Because, at first, they might not make sense, but they can persist through the years and at some point stop being seen as just disconnected and meaningless statements, and start being viewed as absolute and unbreakable truths. That depends on the public situation at the time.
Those writings of Slytherin, which seemed like nonsense with no impact back in the 10th century, would become a tool of oppression more than 700 years later.
Even with wizards and muggles living together normally and the rise of witch hunts happening, the magical community was aware that the threat from muggles affected the muggles themselves much more than it affected them.
Because wizards had a big advantage over them, of course. Many wizards died, were captured during that time, and lost their lives. But most of these wizards were young, without many magical skills, or even adult wizards who were more mediocre, because most wizards could easily get out of the traps that muggles made. In fact, there was a witch who let herself get captured. She would disguise herself and let them catch her, because she would freeze the flames of the bonfires and love the tickling sensation they gave her. Gwendolyn the Weird was even featured on a chocolate frog card. Because of that, it was very common for wizards not to fight back against Muggle threats with combat magic, since they knew they had the upper hand. Godric Gryffindor, for example, who was very noble, he had a sword precisely to duel with Muggles, since he knew that if he used magic, the Muggle wouldn't stand a chance. So, for him, it was fair to fight these duels with a sword, on equal terms. Obviously, not every wizard acted like that. There were wizards who really attacked, who cast spells. And why was the witch hunt a threat to the Muggles themselves? Because many Muggle women were killed, accused of witchcraft, without actually being witches. But then things started to change, and public opinion in the wizarding world took a significant turn.
After the International Statute of Secrecy in Magic came into effect in 1692, the entire magical community around the world began to live in secrecy.
Everything magical was hidden. Creatures, places, everything. And this was a very traumatic period for wizards, especially because living together with Muggles was common. Many wizards married Muggles without caring. So, think about what would happen in the case of a witch who was married to a Muggle, or the other way around. And now, one of them had to live in secret.
So, marriages between Muggles and witches reached the lowest level in history, mainly because of this fear of breaking the new law. Under these conditions of uncertainty, fear, and resentment, the doctrine of blood purity began to gain widespread strength.
Those who adopted this ideology were also the ones who most opposed the International Statute of Secrecy. Instead, they advocated for an open war against the Muggles. And now, a growing number of wizards declared that the marriage of a wizard with a Muggle was disgusting, repulsive, and would pollute magical blood, which was something unnatural. But wizard and Muggle marriages had been common for centuries. Those who during this period called themselves pure probably didn't have a higher proportion of magical blood than their peers who married Muggles. So, calling yourself and your family pureblood was a political and social stance. Just like the terms used such as Muggle-born were political and social, and not a statement of biological fact. A person wasn't born biologically a Muggle and then became a wizard. So, Salazar Slytherin's writings started to be used as irrefutable proof by purebloods, along with rather dubious studies without any confirmation. There, in the 18th century, indicators of blood purity once again began to dominate the purebloods discourse, and more, the magical community was taken over by this nefarious and deceitful ideology. Obviously, successive studies in the Department of Mysteries proved that all these claims were wrong. Even so, many supporters of this ideology continue to cite and use these blood purity commandments as they please. Over the decades,
after the Statute and after that chaotic scenario, marriages between wizards and muggles slowly started to return until they reached normal levels again.
And that never led to the widespread discovery of the wizarding world.
In fact, there are books published about how Muggle husbands and wives are completely faithful to this secret of the magical world. In the book The Philosophy of the Mundane, why do Muggles prefer not to know about the Zegbite?
He reports how Muggles prefer not to expose their husbands or wives by talking about witchcraft, even when they get divorced, because there's a huge chance that these people will be called crazy in the Muggle community. Imagine you end a marriage and say, "No, my ex was a witch. It's true, she was a witch."
More than 1,000 years after Salazar Slytherin lived, his prejudiced and wicked writings had finally contaminated a large part of the families who considered themselves traditionally pure during the Second Wizarding War.
With the success of Voldemort's coup against the Ministry of Magic, the puppet government established the Muggle-born Registration Commission, which was nothing more than a tool of the system to hunt down and imprison wizards who came from non-magical families, accusing them of the impossible crime of stealing magic from other wizards. Voldemort's puppet government promoted the ideology of blood purity, just as Slytherin did in the 10th century, but without strength. But now, using the machinery of the state, with propaganda about how to identify bad blood in a peaceful pureblood society. In these materials, they portrayed pureblood wizards as peaceful and good, and bad bloods, which was the derogatory term they used.
Muggle-borns were considered dangerous and violent, and the way to identify them was based on so many lies, already proven false, that Salazar Slytherin used to say.
Studying at Hogwarts became mandatory. Attendance at Hogwarts became mandatory. With this government, which it wasn't before. Previously, parents could homeschool their children, but under Voldemort's puppet government, Hogwarts attendance became mandatory.
That way, they could more easily capture Muggle-borns and also shape all the content students learned so they would follow the pureblood ideology.
The subject Muggle studies was completely changed and went from being a somewhat uninteresting subject about the Muggle way of life, how they saw things, how they lived with electricity and so on, to a subject that treated Muggles like animals, like pigs born as Muggles. They were hunted, captured, tortured, thrown into Azkaban, and many died, simply for committing the crime of being what they were since birth, for being something they couldn't even choose. Prejudice is a dangerous weapon, and many times, it comes disguised in an innocent way, with a text, an article that no one takes seriously, a joke, an opinion. But, in the end, it's just the big symptom of a very sick society, whether magical or not. And at some point, what was once considered incredible and admirable, like being born into a non-magical family but having magic, it can start to be seen with contempt, disgust, and even become a target of oppression. And that's how the prejudice against Muggle-borns arose, how this term came about, and how the ideology of blood purity started. This information is from official sources and materials. You can find the text Blood Purity on the official Harry Potter website, and find information about the International Statute of Secrecy and Magic, also on the same site. In the books of the saga themselves, anyway, it's all there. I'll see you in the next episode, and until then, mischief managed.